since it's 3, we might go ahead then. It's wonderful to see so many people coming in. I'm Rachel Gordon, and I teach in the Department of Religion and the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. And we're delighted to have you with us today for our afternoon talk. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest. Sarah Imhoff is an associate professor of religious studies and Jewish studies at Indiana University. Her research focuses on questions about how embodiment makes religious meaning and how religious discourse makes bodies. She is the author of Masculinity and the Making of American Judaism, which argues that American Jewish men in the early 20th century were gendered differently from American norms, and that this masculinity helped acculturated Jews argue for the value of an American Judaism. And we recently read an excerpt from this book in one of my undergraduate courses, and I have to say it's one of those very academic books that is also very engaging to non-professor people. The students, many of whom are here today, were in rapt attention when we were reading this together. Professor Imhoff is also the co-editor of the journal American Religion. And I just want to mention that today's event is being sponsored by the Shoresting Endowment in American Jewish Culture. During and after Professor Imhoff's talk, you are welcome to put questions and comments in the chat or that Q&A section, and we will look forward to getting to them after the presentation. So I think I can turn it over to Professor Imhoff now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. It's really lovely to be here with you virtually and great to see all these participants. So just so you don't have to look at my face exclusively for the next 35 or 40 minutes, I've created some slides. There are some pretty striking images from the case and from newspapers, so I'll share a couple of those with you too as we go. All right. On May 21st, 1924, Chicago teenagers Nathan Babe Leopold and Richard Dickie Loeb kidnapped and murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks. They took Franks from their Southside neighborhood, killed him, poured acid onto his face and circumcised penis in order to hinder identification, placed his body in a culvert, and began to write a ransom note to the boy's parents. Although they had planned to commit the perfect crime, a man had already discovered the body before the ransom note reached Mr. Franks. The water in the culvert washed away the acid, so the boy was identifiable, and Loeb dropped his custom-made glasses on the ground nearby. The police brought the two in for questioning, and eventually they confessed to the crime. Their families then hired the famed charismatic attorney Clarence Darrow, who had the young men change their pleas to guilty. So though much of the literature still calls the procedure a trial, it wasn't. Because they had already pleaded guilty, Leopold and Loeb had a sentencing hearing with a single judge. Instead of jurors, reporters sat in the otherwise empty jury box. The judge, in the end, imposed life sentences instead of the death penalty, marking a victory for Darrow and for Leopold and Loeb. I first got interested in the Leopold and Loeb case when I was researching ideas about Jewish gender in the US. They present a fascinating case for so many reasons, but I'll just mention a couple here. First, and this is something I talk about at more length in my book, but they're a cool example of it. Most Jews and non-Jews alike thought that Jews were nonviolent. So my other work on Jewish crime and criminals turned up lots of shared assumptions about how Jewish men who broke the law were kind of different sorts of criminals than their non-Jewish criminal neighbors. In today's language, we might say that people assumed Jews were more likely to engage in white-collar crime, like insurance fraud, than violent crime. Even anti-Semites sometimes said that Jewish criminals didn't engage in courageous crime. So this case provided a really fascinating moment. How would the public, both Jewish and not Jewish, think about these two criminals who admitted to this violent crime? Second, the Leopold and Loeb hearing was a media sensation in its day. It had the celebrity lawyer, the newfangled psychiatric experts, a sex scandal, all witnessed by reporters who are sitting there in the jury box and in the seats. That meant it was a fascinating historical window into the time. What did people find interesting, surprising, titillating? Two of those things, it turned out, were the gender and sexuality of these young Jewish men. Third, there's something about the story of a perfect crime that seems to hold our attention. And as Dr. Gordon's students are thinking about this semester as they read Compulsion, or you can see when you watch Alfred Hitchcock's Rope from 1948, there's Compulsion, or Swoon from 1992 is also based on this case, or Murder by Numbers, which has a significant thread of its plot growing up out of this case. So this story has something about it, this perfect crime, that people still think is fascinating to look at, to ask about, to think about the psychology of the people who perpetrated this crime. So it's not for nothing that this gets called the crime of the century. By the way, other things also get called the crime of the century, but this is one of them. So the Leopold and Loeb case illuminates the complex relationship among Jewishness, gender, and sexuality and crime. This relationship was more associative than it was causal. Nobody argued that Jewishness caused criminal behavior or that unmanly men all became criminals. But when Jews did commit crimes, people imagined those crimes were not the ones associated with the masculine traits of violence or aggression or overpowering adult women sexually. Jewish men's crimes, people imagined, were of intellect, not passion. They were manipulation, not aggression. They were about outsmarting, but not overpowering. People assumed that Jewish men didn't commit crimes of violence. Remarkably, even in Leopold and Loeb's case, the hearing and the media classified the crime as part of Leopold's insistence on experiment. The two of them were very interested in Nietzsche and other philosophers. And so the media too thought about them in these terms. So it was an experiment, the crime, rather than a gruesome act of murder, although occasionally that came up too. And perhaps that's in part because Americans imagined that Jewish men had more intellect than physical prowess. When Jewish men did commit violent crimes, then the culture needed some sort of explanation for it. So a few more details. Even before Leopold and Loeb were brought in for questioning, the newspapers fixated on the most telling clue, the eyeglasses found at the scene. This is actually a picture of the eyeglasses found at the scene. These were no ordinary glasses, and they indicated what kind of person committed the crime. The Chicago Daily Tribune offered the headline, "Glasses near body, not such as man wears." So this article continues its speculation about the gender of the perpetrator. A woman probably owned the pair of horn-rimmed spectacles picked up on in the Southside swamp. It would be a strange man, a little bit of a wizened-faced fellow who could wear these, said one of the opticians. Not only are the circumferences of the lenses extraordinarily small for men's glasses, but the ear supports are far too short for the average masculine head. According to the optician, a normal man would not be wearing these glasses. Chief of Detective Michael Hughes explained how one could know other physical characteristics of the wearer of these glasses. We know this. They were not purchased by a laboring man or a man who is employed with his hands. Those who labor physically do not need such spectacles. I am told it must have been a highly intelligent person who wore these glasses. A high-strung, nervous temperament. Hughes' statement to the public clearly signaled the non-normative gender of the perpetrator. He would be nervous and weak. He wouldn't be a laborer. He would have a small feminine face. The reading glasses also gave away something else. They had a highly unusual patented hinge, and the police used it to identify it and trace it back to Leopold. 10 days after the murder, Leopold and Loeb were arrested. They were quickly brought in for questioning, and from then on, the press, the lawyers, and the expert witnesses no longer needed to speculate on the identity of the perpetrators. They could concentrate their speculations on the bodies and temperaments of these two men. So here's another brief bit, but here this is from the hearing transcript. The Q is for question, the A is for answer here. And this is the lawyer asking the person who received a telephone call from one of the perpetrators. Now, will you describe the kind of voice that you heard on the telephone? Was it a voice you were familiar with? No. Was it a masculine or feminine voice? Masculine. Was there any other thing about the voice that you noted at the time? Well, it sounded like it was not a gruff voice. Well, how would you describe it? It was more of a cultured voice than a gruff voice. So as the musings on the glasses, and then this discussion of the voice, it wasn't gruff, it was very cultured. One of the most obvious ways that both the medical experts who testified during the hearing and the press talked about the young men's gender and sexuality was through their bodies. The medical and legal team came together, the medical and the legal discussions came together on the bodies of Leopold and Loeb, painting a picture of them as having abnormal traits for men in a constellation of areas, physiologically, sexually, behaviorally, and also kind of philosophically. Newspapers across the country carried updates about the case. Here, this is at the very end of the trial, one from Omaha, but we could see them in every city. I think it's really fun to think about newspapers, and especially for Dr. Gordon's students who are thinking about popular culture. What do we know from newspapers? They're a great set of resources for the historian, in part because they tell us facts, yes, but we can also get statements of facts from other sources. We can see them in hearings, we can see them in police reports, right? There are lots of possible ways that we can get things that look like facts. And that's not to say that any of those sources are perfect, but many sources strive to tell us facts. But for me, what's really interesting is they can tell us what people were interested in, what caught their attention, what the editors of the newspapers think the headlines should be. And Leopold and Loeb were in a lot of headlines. As the case gained publicity, famous phrenologists of the time offered their expert opinions in the press. So if you don't know what phrenology is or physiognomy, you're going to get to know. These diagnoses often accompanied sketch diagrams of Leopold and Loeb's faces and heads. This is one. It's a real one from the case. These diagrams combined medical information, such as the location of the pituitary gland, of your ear, with psychosexual and moral traits, such as lacks reason, moral, and benevolent power, or yes, which you can see in the forehead. According to one highly publicized diagram, Leopold had sensuous lips. There you can see the label at the bottom, but the shape of his nose indicated aggressiveness, while a spot behind his ear, circled as if by like a sports broadcaster, showed his destructive instinct. His sensuality, a trait associated more with womanhood than manhood in this time period, coexisted alongside aggression and his desire for destruction, which would have been associated with male vices. So Leopold in this diagram is an odd mixture of masculine and feminine phenotypes. It's kind of a strangely gendered character. In addition to his sensuous lips, we'll go back to Leopold for a second, there he is. We'll go back to Loeb, also had excessive vanity. This one is from the Chicago Daily Tribune, but there's also a very similar one in the New York Daily News. This one says, his feminine nature shows in the nose. A Tribune sketch caption read, a phrenologist pronounces this boy of a feminine type of mind, eager for applause and easily led. while another discussed his delicate hands. Still another article quoted a phrenologist who averred Leopold is the male and Loeb is the female when it comes to a comparison of the temperaments of the two. A psychoanalyst explained that Loeb's head showed balance between a feminine type and a masculine type. These articles painted both Leopold and Loeb with both masculine and feminine characteristics, noting that their differently gendered qualities were evident through, yes, their faces and their bodily structure. The press doesn't actually, in this moment, seem very invested in differentiating Leopold and Loeb. So both were branded with abnormal gender and sexuality similarly. And in fact, occasionally you can see the sketches, the labels switched on them. One article cried, Loeb followed Leopold whims, experts explain. And another said, Loeb is the master of Leopold under solemn pact made. Sex inferiority is factor. So if you follow that, one of them says Leopold is the boss and one of them says Loeb is the boss. Though the first article insisted Leopold was dominant and more masculine, the second one says the reverse. Because the second one focused on his lack of masculine traits, such as his lack of prowess in athletics, and explained that he felt inferior physically to others and could not mingle on equal terms with them physically. The second article quoted a phrenologist as saying, the patient has always been something of a physical coward. I think it's important to say for a moment that these diagrams are, I don't know what the technical term is, maybe hogwash, right? They're almost laughable to us, that there's like a diagram where you could look at the shape of somebody's nose and then know something about their moral character or their personality traits. The feminine nature shows in the nose, which I think is the weirdest thing ever, that you would think that that is science, except it is. Phrenology, which is the study of the cranium, so that's like the head shape, and physiognomy, which is more like this, although sometimes phrenologists would do this too. That's a study of facial features. They're imagined that they can tell us something about personality and intelligence. These things were, in fact, science during this time. There's a temptation for us to call it pseudoscience, and that's partially because we want to signal that we don't think that this is true anymore. This isn't scientific anymore. But this is, in fact, the way science works. Old ideas are revised with new data. And at the time, this stuff really was scientific. It was scientific for the public. It was scientific in courtrooms. The experts who are brought in are referred to in that way. It's also interesting that the relatively new science of psychiatry here is occurring right alongside these phrenology and physiognomy arguments. So like now we still have psychiatrists who can tell us things that we think of as experts, but we definitely don't have physiognomists who are showing up in courtrooms saying, well, just look at the shape of his nose. We know that he must be feminine or something like that. It's also worth saying that this kind of science, the phrenology, physiognomy, related eugenic sciences, were used to make proper statements about proper gender roles. So they would show up in other places too, like here's a relatively famous one. You also get very similar images of like, here's the good mother and here's the not good mother. And we're supposed to be able to know something about this by head shape. They describe them. These are two sketches that are designed for young ladies. They should look at the profile of the man that they're contemplating becoming in a relationship with, and then they can know from the profile, will this man be a good husband or not? And you want the one on the left. I mean, the one on the right is frowning, so I think we already intuited that he's not the guy you want. But this is the kind of thing that you would see not only in a courtroom, but you'd see in other spaces too. These kinds of science were also used to make political arguments about the suitability of different immigrant groups to the US. Famous scientific studies linked the size and shapes of people's skulls, even over generations, to how civilized each ethnic or religious group was and how well suited they were to American society. So these sorts of scientific images of heads and skulls wouldn't have seemed weird to an American public then, the way that they seem a little bit weird and maybe even silly now. The public, like the practitioners themselves, saw these as science. So in addition to these kinds of sciences that told the public and the judge things about the men's sexuality, about the men's gender, there was some more explicit discussion of the men's sexuality. During the hearing, the prosecution often referred to the men's failed exploits with women. The point was that these men couldn't properly direct their sexuality. Moreover, although they were fixated on sex, according to the state, they didn't fruitfully experience it. The attorneys discussed how the men picked up a couple of girls, and in reference to another event, who didn't come across. Although the young men attempted in these situations to pursue sexual activities with women, the state emphasized that Leopold and Loeb were unsuccessful. Their lack of sex with Janes, who were probably prostitutes, indicated that even their inappropriate attempts at sex, i.e. prostitution, with women who purportedly have sex with any man, did not culminate in success. The most pervasive discussion of sexuality, however, focused on the men's fantasies, which were sometimes coded as homosexual. The state referred to their vile and unnatural practices. Robert Crowe, the state's attorney, insisted that what seemed like fainting spells or epilepsy were actually episodes of drunkenness and debauchery. When Loeb was drunk one night, what looked like frothing at the mouth was actually his own vomit on his face. And during this incident, Crowe insinuated, Loeb demonstrated his perversion. He wanted to lick a couple of waiters. I know, that's really weird. I don't know who wants to lick waiters. Well, you might take a step back and wonder, what the heck does this case have to do with sex? Two young men kidnapped and killed a teenage boy, but there's no evidence of sexual assault. The only remotely sex-related thing about the crime seemed to be that the killers poured acid on Bobby Frank's genitals. But that, everyone agreed, was in the hopes of disguising Frank's identity, because a circumcised penis would point to somebody from Chicago's Jewish community, and they wanted to obscure that fact. But in the process of the hearing, the experts and lawyers fixated on sex and sexuality. The newspapers likewise took up the issue. What were Leopold and Loeb like sexually? Were they normal? If they weren't sexually normal, what were they up to? What were the details? What was their relationship? If they had a sexual relationship, who was dominant? Right, and of course, this relied on a heterosexual model where if you have a partnership, you must have one dominant and one more submissive person. Fascinating to me is that no one stopped to explain exactly why their sexuality should matter for the outcome of the hearing. It was as though everyone had tacitly agreed that any abnormal sexual behavior was centrally relevant. Perhaps the state side thought it could rely on an assumed relationship between abnormal sexuality and criminality. Perhaps Darrow's team thought it would bolster their argument for insanity. But both sides did a lot of assuming that people already knew what abnormal sexuality was and what it meant for the sentencing of Leopold and Loeb. So the state sought to establish a fraught sexual relationship between Leopold and Loeb, and then suggested that these abnormal inclinations somehow led them to assault Bobby Franks. They dwelled extensively on a note from Leopold to Loeb, suggesting that they not quarrel in public because people would see the argument as a falling out of cocksuckers. Like, they talk about this note a lot. It's in the hearing for a remarkably long time. They discuss whether this is actually a popular phrase. One person on the state side asked Leopold several times if he had committed any acts of perversion on Loeb or another Jewish friend. The attorneys read into evidence at length the medical examiner's report that suggested the victim's rectum was dilated and would easily admit one middle finger, even though the very same report indicated there was no evidence of penetration whatsoever. The court clearly considered this line of inquiry lurid because during some of these discussions, the court asked the women present to leave. In addition to asking Leopold and Loeb directly about their sexual practices, both attorneys paraded a series of medical witnesses to discuss the young men's physiology and its relevant relation to their deviant sexual behaviors and identity. Darrow called the president of the American Psychiatric Association to explain how their overdeveloped intellect and underdeveloped bodies were consonant with their manifestations, this is his quote, manifestations of a more or less homosexual character. And all of that suggested that they were unhealthy or diseased and therefore shouldn't be held responsible to the same degree as healthy people. The state brought in Dr. Harold Douglas Singer, director of the Illinois State Psychopathic Institute and expert on mental hygiene, who had read the medical reports in detail. And so Singer is going to testify. In this king-slave fantasy, which is what he says the two of them experience, my experience with such fantasies would indicate that it has a homosexual significance. And then he explains about Leopold and Loeb in particular. In exchange for doing what Loeb wanted, Loeb would submit to certain homosexual practices. That is a further indication of fact, which would tend to support my general understanding of what such a fantasy would represent, that is, homosexual longing. Both sides agreed that the men had homosexual desires and experiences, and that those were relevant to the crime. Of course, they thought that that should mean two very different things. The papers thought it was relevant too. They explored Leopold's supposed sadomasochistic fantasy. So here's one headline, Slayers, King and Slave, and dozens more like it in the following weeks in a bunch of papers. Journalists, again, marshaled phrenological diagrams to show that Loeb had a great love of sex, but that Leopold's sex feelings dominate his social ideals. The papers sometimes had fits of modesty, though, when they obliquely mentioned the men's pact dealing with abnormal sex matters, which the Tribune said it would not print. The conception of this intimate relationship between sexual abnormality and mental abnormality existed well beyond the Leopold and Loeb case. So for instance, in a 1917 address to the National Association of Jewish Social Workers on how to understand and pursue social work, Samuel Rabinowitz joined together the mental defective, the sexual degenerate, the moral pervert, and the insane all together. They were one category. On a much larger stage, Sigmund Freud, Havelock Ellis, and other psychoanalysts argued for clear links between mental and sexual abnormality. And both the hearings and the media echoed the same sense of connection when it came to Leopold and Loeb's abnormality and their crime. So even though the crime didn't seem to have a sexual motive, everyone seemed to think these men's sexuality was relevant. I want to pause here and note something. The hearing documents and the press spent a lot of time discussing these men, their faces, their heads, their bodies, their sexuality, their brains, their personalities. But what about Jewishness? The hearings and the press actually had little to say explicitly about Jewishness. That might surprise us, given that 1924 was a time in which xenophobia was on the rise. It was the same year of the Johnson-Reed Act that severely restricted immigration, and that really affected Jews coming from Eastern Europe, as well as other populations coming from other places that weren't Western Europe, so Eastern Europe, Asia, etc. Anti-Semitism wasn't absolutely dominant and pervasive, but it certainly at this moment would rear its head in social and political spaces across the country. So we might have thought that the public would have a lot to say about Leopold and Loeb's Jewishness. But it seems like they didn't. That, however, doesn't mean that it was totally absent. In fact, many of the same gendered traits that we've discussed, these brains but not brawn ideas, weakness, not a laboring type from those glasses, the cultured person from the telephone call, a lot of these gendered traits lined up with ideas about Jewish men. So in some ways, this part reminds me of the pilot of the West Wing, which I know it totally dates me, but everybody bear with me for a second, where one woman snarkily derides Josh Lyman's New York sense of humor, and then she explodes and she's like, oh, they think they're so smart. They just think they're smarter than everybody. And then you kind of watch it dawn on everybody in the room that she actually means Jewish. So she evokes these personality traits, smartness, cleverness, and geography, New York. And in this way, everybody in the room gets that she's saying something about Jewishness, even though she doesn't use a word. So I think there's something kind of similar happening here. Unlike this West Wing character, most of the commentators on the Leopold and Loeb crime didn't imply explicitly anti-Semitic things. But there were moments that did imply Jewishness. We've seen a few of them, like the description of the glasses and the scientific diagrams of the head. And we might say that those kind of implied Jewishness through race or ethnicity, right? Because it's about the appearance or the shape of the head or the body. But there were also moments in the hearing, and occasionally in the papers too, that implied Jewishness from a religious side. Okay, so here's Robert Crow. He's on the state side, and here he's summarizing. And in the hearing transcript, he's not the clearest speaker. He doesn't speak in very obvious sentences all the time, so I'll help a little bit here. He's summarizing what's happened. He says, the three wise men from the East who came on to tell your honor, he's talking to the judge, about these little babes. And here he's sarcastically referring to Leopold and Loeb, who Darrow has portrayed as kind of big teenagers or underdeveloped humans. And being three wise men brought on from the East, they wanted to make the picture a little more perfect. He's referring to the psychiatrists and the psychiatric experts that Darrow has brought. And he's, as you can tell, making a weird allusion here to the three wise men and Jesus. So then he goes on and says, one of these three wise men was sacrilegious enough to say that this pervert, this murderer, this kidnapper, thought that he was the Christ child and that he thought that his mother was the Madonna, without a syllable of evidence anyplace to support the blasphemous and sacrilegious statement. Who said that this young pervert over there thought he was the Christ child? So Crow here is hearkening back to the psychiatric testimony and saying it's absolutely unacceptable because the psychiatrist attributes these religious ideas to that pervert. So fun fact, perversion, the word perversion or pervert originally comes not from a sexual context, but from a religious one. So the early versions of it are about turning away from religion and from standard theological ideas, rejecting standard theological ideas. And so in that way, kind of becoming abnormal religiously. But then by this point, it can mean both sexual perversion and other kinds of perversion, other kinds of turning away from norms. Today, it pretty much just means the sexual version. But at this time, it could have evoked either. In this context, of course, with Crow, definitely he's calling upon the sexual one. But he's also, in a way, invoking the religious one. So here we've got a sense that there is a religious error that's happening. He kind of attributes that error to Darrow, which would make sense given Darrow's reputation as somebody like the following year, he is the lead counsel in the Scopes trial, where the idea of teaching evolution is put on trial. He's on the side of evolution. So Crow is suggesting here that the abnormal sexuality and the abnormal religious or the perverted religious ideas have come together, and Leopold and Loeb are guilty of both of these kinds of perversions. And he also suggests not only are they doing things sexually that are not normal and they have religious beliefs that are not normal, but somehow this constitutes evidence for criminality and for their culpability, like they should be held responsible for this. Hang on one sec, oops. There we go. He also says, I believe in God. So this is Crow, who's making a summary statement, I believe in God. And that's him taking a shot at Darrow for not being on the side of God, which would be famous in the Scopes trial the next year. And that is a fault in this case, he says sarcastically, a fault not only to the two murderers, but a fault to the master pleader whose profession it is to protect murder in this county. That's Darrow. Moments later, alluding to the Lord's Prayer, he contrasted his explicitly Christian creed with the confused and wayward atheism of Leopold. I have a right to forgive those who trespass against me in the hopes that I will in the hereafter be forgiven for my trespasses. I live that religion. So we can tell that Crow is trying to set up, I'm the good religious guy, these people are the abnormal, they're atheists, they're confused about Christianity. He doesn't have to quite say Jewish, but you get the idea that he's piling up the ideas that they're abnormal sexually and they're abnormal in these religious ways. They don't think about Jesus or the Madonna in the proper ways. So you might imagine that Darrow would say, well, all of that's irrelevant. But interestingly, he will also make a connection to religion. So Darrow says, they found out something about Leopold, his sex life, his early sex life. He had some trouble. There were endocrine disorders, there was a fantasy life, there was the slave king fantasy. So here Darrow is thinking about very physical things and endocrine disorder, along with sexuality that we've seen in the case. So he's kind of building the case that Leopold and Loeb are not quite as culpable as they otherwise would be. They shouldn't be executed, which he's arguing, because they have physical issues, they have mental issues, and that these things are tied together so that they shouldn't be held to, they shouldn't experience the death penalty, right? So he'll continue here, and he says his interest in religion. Your Honor remembers the churches. The idea his mother was a Madonna, his aunt was a Madonna. He classified the churches, his Christ idea, his atheism that was confirmed by his mother's death. So Darrow here is saying not, oh, what's happened here with Leopold is that there's a rejection of proper religion, but that his ideas about religion similarly suggest perhaps there is mental illness. And that mental illness, he says, is continuous with the kinds of physical illness that we would see in an endocrine disorder, the kinds of mental illness that we would see in some of these exhibited moments of sexuality. So we've got both sides of the case, both the state and Darrow, saying, oh, there's something here about religion, about abnormal religion. They're both saying there's something abnormal about sexuality here and gender. So in the Leopold and Loeb case, there they are, the two of them, we see that Jewishness, racial, religious, or both, was evoked, but rarely called by name. Jews and non-Jews, the accused and their defenders alike, the participants and the media, each agreed that abnormal masculinity and sexuality were linked with criminality. Everyone knew that Leopold and Loeb were murderers, and thus everyone agreed that they had strayed from Judaism and had abnormal sexual desires and practices. The only question up for debate was how deep their abnormality went and what the implications for their moral culpability should be. So as fascinating as this case is by itself, it also gestures toward a larger point about Jewishness and gender and crime. It's not that Jewishness was tautologically associated with crime. Nobody thought that all Jews were criminals. But when Jewish men did commit crimes, both Jews and non-Jews assumed they were of a certain sort, perhaps conniving or profit-driven, but without violence. Jewish crimes then were not manly crimes. So how could Americans make sense of Jews who did commit violent crimes? Either they could dismiss them as anomalous, which is basically what happens in the case of organized crime and organized criminals. Or they could come up with another explanation. In the Leopold and Loeb case, that other explanation was abnormal gender and sexuality. And the answer was, these two were perverts. Thanks. I will stop my screen share now.
Thank you, Professor Imhoff. Before we go to audience questions and comments, which you're welcome to type in there in the Q&A, I wanted to also mention that we've got a talk on Thursday at noon with a professor from Ben Gurion University about debates on Israeli feminism. So that's another Center for Jewish Studies event that's happening this Thursday at noon. So we are open now to your comments and questions. One thing, Professor Imhoff, that my class was thinking about was so many people don't know about this case. And in a way, it seems like what you presented suggests that what happened was sort of dismissed as abnormal and not associated with all Jews. And so we were kind of grappling with this question of what is it that we understand about the American Jewish experience by understanding this case, or why should people know about it when it seems like it falls outside of the mainstream experience? So what do you think? Does this shed light on something about American Jews at this time or American culture?
Yeah, so I think the case itself is so particular that we wouldn't say that Leopold and Loeb represent, broader trends in American Jewish masculinity or any of those things. But what I do think is more relevant is the way that the Jewish community responded, if we're thinking about how did this matter for American Jews, because they could have done a few things. They could have said, actually, these guys aren't Jewish at all. One of them has a Catholic mom, so he's not really Jewish. Look, they like Nietzsche. That's turning their back on Judaism. Like, they're not Jewish at all. They didn't quite do that, but they did versions of that. So, such as, say, these men turned their back on Judaism, and that's the only way they could have ended up like this. They could have almost taken it personally and tried to defend them. That doesn't seem to happen either. I think it's interesting to compare to, say, the Leo Frank case, where the Jewish community really does rally behind Leo Frank and say, he's one of us, he's Jewish, but he's innocent. We just don't see that at all here. We don't see the Jewish community even really rallying around, make sure he doesn't get the death, make sure they don't get the death penalty. Not even that happens. So I think it's interesting to note that the Jewish community responds not by saying, oh, we should protect them, or even we're so concerned about the image of Jewishness that we need to defend these guys who are kind of indefensible, right? There are moments if you feel like, oh, the community is really threatened by anti-Semitism and you don't want to stoke that you might end up defending Jewishness, even if it was a couple of murders. People don't seem to react in that way either, right? There's a pretty shared response from both Jews and non-Jews to say, these guys did something terrible, and also they're so abnormal, they're unlike everything else. So even as Jewishness as is evoked, people within the Jewish community don't seem to feel extraordinarily threatened by it, because Leopold and Loeb are seen as so different. Even at the time, nobody's like, yeah, see, they're representative of the Jewish community. We don't even really see that kind of reaction. So I think that's the broader interest if we're thinking about how do American Jews see themselves and their position in the US?
Yeah, thank you. In our audience, Marty Schickman asked, the case has so much in common with blood libel charges, kidnapping, desecration of the body, and yet this sort of mythology of Jewish violence seems to be put aside, ignored even. Why does popular culture overlook that history?
Yeah, that's a really good question. we don't see blood libel so much in the US context, but that is just sort of a cheating answer because so many of the people in the US trace roots to Europe. So it's not something that's totally unfamiliar, but it does seem that in the US, people, as they're making assumptions or creating stereotypes about Jews, that's not quite included. I would say that the idea of abnormal sexuality sometimes does get taken up in stereotypes about Jewish crime so that you could fit into an American stereotype. And this would be an anti-Semitic stereotype, but that if the Jewish community was going to kill, it would be somebody killing a child or a young woman rather than like an adult man getting angry and killing an adult man. So some of those anti-Semitic stereotypes about only going after weak or innocent people, those we can see connections to. But it is interesting that we don't see, well, in the US context, either from Jewish communities or from non-Jews, a lot of evocation of blood libel.
Norm Levy asks, these men lived in the South Side Jewish community. How could they be separated from it so easily?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the answers is that they weren't actually as separate, you know, factually as they kind of make themselves out to be. They know Bobby Franks, he's like 2 degrees removed from them. I think that the answer, if we're thinking about it in an imaginative way, like how could all of these people say, oh, they're not really part of the Jewish community, is because they could imagine that the victims and that the perpetrators were really separate. And the victim was very much identified as part of Southside Jewish culture. So like this 14-year-old boy from our community has been murdered. And then that's what gets identified with the community. And then it's much easier to say, well, those murderers are not part of the community. They're outside it, they're something different. And so that's a much easier story for both people who are intimately familiar with it and people in a larger space to say, even though, of course, as I said, it's not really the fact that it's true.
Another audience member asks, why did Crow refer to Leopold and Loeb as atheists instead of Jews?
Yes, because there is a conversation during the hearing in which they're asked about their religious beliefs. And Leopold specifically says he's an atheist. And the two of them have been reading Nietzsche together, and they take that as license for atheism. So it's not just a slur that he's come up with as like a quick way to imply Jews, although there is sometimes an undercurrent to some either sometimes Christian anti-Semites can think of Jews and atheists as like similar because they deny the divinity of Christ. So there is some continuity between Jewishness and atheism, but here he's referring to something specific from the trial, from the hearing.
One of our students, Ryan Smith, asks, do you think the discussion of the men's sexuality helped their defense and led them to not receive the death penalty?
Yeah, I do. I think Darrow's pretty convincing. By the end, he's shown, whether we now believe the science or not, he's suggested to the judge that these two young men, he emphasizes that they're young men, have experienced what we might think of today as mental illness, and therefore they shouldn't be put to death. And one of the ways he shows that mental illness is by drawing on their sexuality, suggesting that that's really connected to the mental illness. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to be in somebody else's head, but yes, it's clear that the judge was convinced that they shouldn't get the death penalty. And that's Darrow's main argument the whole way down, is that they're not fully culpable because they're a little bit mentally ill. So, and because sexuality feeds right into that.
One of our emeritus Jewish studies professors, Maureen Turam, says, thank you for this talk. I have two questions. One involves male sensuality in the teens and 20s. Don't you think Rudolph Valentino and Eddie Cantor exhibit male sensuousness in the teens and 20s? Freud and Havelock connect marginal sexuality with crime. What are you referring to?
So that second one, it's less that Havelock Ellis or Sigmund Freud connect marginal sexuality and crime, and more that other people will use Freud or Ellis to say, oh, this is abnormal. These people are antisocial. They're somehow on the margins of society. So that's not something that either Freud or Ellis would say, like, oh, they're not, they don't think about, say, homosexuality as related to criminality, but it is a discourse that gets picked up by others, and then others make those connections. So they would seem, those connections might seem somewhat familiar, but you wouldn't get them just from reading Freud or reading Ellis. Mm-hmm. And the other question was, oh yeah, male sensuality. Yes, I don't think that sensuality was exclusively feminine. But there were, just like most of these gendered traits, like both of these men end up with a mix of gendered traits. So gender isn't an absolute list, but sensuality was more associated with women. Not to say it couldn't possibly be associated with men. And like Eddie Cantor and Rudolph Valentino, they're significantly manly in other ways. The roles that they play, the way that they're kind of publicly heterosexual often, means that then that sensuousness can get read as part of their masculinity without seeming too threatening. Whereas when you pile sensuous lips on top of feminine nature shows in the nose, then you end up with a real, like, oh, this picture of gender seems abnormal. Whereas over here, we just have like, oh, it's a sensuality. So yes, I think it's right to say there is a male sensuality that's popular and available, but in combination with many other things that don't quite fit with people's ideas of masculinity, it creates a different gendered image for Leopold and Loeb.
Mm. Another one of our Jewish studies students, Maya Cohen, asks, was atheism viewed as more wrong than Judaism at the time?
Yes, yes, it was. In part because many Christians, even the Christians who were supersessionist, imagined that there was some truth to Judaism and that people who were Jewish might be moral for reasons. And so say some Christians would imagine, oh, the Jews basically read the Old Testament. We recognize that as the source of some morality, even if we don't think that they have all of the theological answers, right? Like they've failed to accept Jesus, but still they have some shared tradition. We recognize that that might be a tradition that leads to morality. Whereas most people did not. Do I think that? I think that's probably true. I think most people thought that atheists didn't have a guaranteed moral center, right? If you were an atheist, where does your morality come from? You don't even believe in God. If you don't believe in the afterlife, why would you behave morally in this life? Now, of course, most of us can actually come up with compelling answers to that question, but it is true that at the time, in general, atheists were viewed with a much dimmer view than Jews. And some of that is the imagined proximity of Judaism to Christianity.
Another student, Jacob Geiner, asks, was there any disavowal of or commentary on their atheism from more observant Jewish communities or individuals? I feel like you touched on that, how it became an opportunity.
Yeah, there are a couple of people who quite publicly say, this is what happens when you ditch Judaism. Like if you leave Judaism, look at the places you can go. If they had stayed within the Jewish fold, if they had continued to, and this is sort of reinforces that idea of they're outside the community. If they had stayed within the Jewish fold, if they had practiced Judaism, they never would have done this. So yes, there is a sense that a few Jewish leaders publicly say, yeah, well, the problem is they gave up on Judaism, they left Judaism for atheism, and that's what you get, right? They're not quite that flippant about it, but they do say, like, that's an extreme example of what you can get if you leave Judaism.
Yeah, I don't know if it came up in your research, but did you find rabbis or just Jewish communal leaders sermonizing or talking more or less on this than you would have? Sometimes the silence speaks volumes too.
Yes, I would say less than I expected. Yeah, but like the Jewish press is not like the secular press, right? The secular press is like Leopold and Loeb are on the front page for like every day for weeks, or like they go away for a day and they're back, right? The Jewish press is not quite like that, which to me says there's a shared sense of like, this isn't particularly a Jewish issue, right? It's a people committed a crime issue, or it's a like Bobby Franks has been murdered issue, but the kind of salacious details of the hearing don't seem to captivate the Jewish press in the way that they do the secular press.
Right. And I guess it's also that feeling of the time of let's not discuss unpleasant things.
Yeah, I think that's some of it too. Like, well, we all agree they did a terrible thing, and like, and it seems like they don't imagine that the problem is Jewishness, and because other people seem not to be pointing a finger and saying, oh, the problem was their Jewishness, then they're not forced in a place to respond or to defend Jewishness. Then sometimes they can, not.
Yeah. Another student, Tori Schulman, asked, does it appear that this case changed the views of Americans regarding thinking of only nonviolent or non-courageous from Jews? Or since Loeb and Leopold were not seen as representative of the Jewish community, was this just viewed as an anomaly?
Yeah, I think it really was viewed as an anomaly. That's a great question. But yeah, I think that mostly people were like, whoa, that's really fascinating and weird. And did you see everything that went on in that case? Right. I think it's so anomalous. Like, I think that's part of what's happening, that we get that every 20 years we still get a new film about it, right? That there is something quite unusual about this case. I think the thing that tips the scales to challenge this idea more than anything is actually organized crime, and how there's more of it and it's more public into the 30s. So there is, by I would say the end of the 30s, a shared sense that like, oh yeah, there are Jewish gangsters, and like they do kind of mean things like shoot each other, right? I think that is the thing that challenges this idea more than this like super public case. You could imagine that lots of people were like, whoa, Jews can be just as violent as everybody else. But I didn't find anybody saying that. And it doesn't seem like after that, people are like, we should really reevaluate what we thought about Jewish men. Like, I don't see that either.
Yeah, I mean, related to that, I guess one of the things that the case raised for me was thinking about the Jewish family, especially because these men were young enough that they weren't that far removed and away from the influence of their families. And there are also stereotypes about the warmth and whatever other positive things of the Jewish family. And so I was wondering what had happened in these men's homes that may or may not have led to them being the way they were. And I don't know if you found it sparked any kind of Jewish self-reflection or questioning about that.
Not particularly. I don't think it sparked a lot of Jewish self-reflection. I mean, I think some people were like, well, one of them had a Catholic mom, or they didn't get enough Jewish instruction. So, but I do think similarly, some of the sets of assumptions, these are Jewish family related, about Jewish men and criminality, follow lines like, well, Jewish men don't drink too much, Jewish men don't beat their wives, so that there's something about the Jewish family that is a safer space. There's something about Jewish masculinity, even if it's not courageous, that also doesn't partake in these masculine vices of, say, alcoholism or violence against women, which is not a vice, right? But terrible behavior. So yeah, it similarly doesn't seem to challenge those kinds of family assumptions, which are obviously wrapped up in the appropriate gender roles within a family, assumptions about those.
Yeah. Adiana Bregman in the audience asked, was the case treated differently in the Chicago or national Jewish press?
Not really. So it gets covered more in Chicago, as you would expect. But, and as I've said, there's a little bit less coverage in the Jewish press than you might expect, or a fair amount less than you might expect. But it's not like we have some example where the press at large sometimes says anti-Semitic things and the Jewish press responds or something like that. And you do see that in other cases, like the couple other cases that I look at in my book, Leo Frank. There's this sort of minor, I don't know, thing that happens with the police commissioner in New York. And both of those cases, you have a larger press that sometimes says things that you would be like, that seems anti-Semitic. And then you have a Jewish press that is like, that's not really how it is. We don't see much of that dynamic here. So yeah, I mean, that's one of those like, oh, it's notable because we don't see it.
Right. Lawrence Beyer asks about the Jews and Murder Incorporated. I don't know if that's something you might want to say something about.
Yeah, so I have not done tons of my own primary research on that, in part because other people have done great research on it. But yes, I think that's one of the other ways that if you were, say, a member of the Jewish community and you were like, oh, Jews don't commit violent crimes, you would have to look at Murder Inc. and wonder, they do seem like, it seems like we have an instance of Jewish men committing violent crimes. Similarly, if you were a non-Jew who was like, oh yes, Jews, when they commit crimes, tend to commit white collar crimes, that seems like it should challenge your assumptions. And there is much more communal discussion about that. Within Jewish communities, there seems to be a like, what do we do about these Jewish gangsters issue? Like, are they sullying our image? How do we make sure that our children don't end up juvenile delinquents, because we all know juvenile delinquents might go on to become gangsters. So that does spark conversation in Jewish communities in ways that Leopold and Loeb don't really. Like, I can't think of, it's not to say there isn't, but I can't think of any kind of social work conversation that says, oh no, how do we make sure we don't have any more Leopold and Loebs? There's plenty of how do we make sure we don't have juvenile delinquents, because juvenile delinquents might get involved with organized crime, or there's a sort of slippery slope between these small crimes of teenagers and organized crime or more violent crime, right? Those conversations do come up, but there's communal conversation around Murder Inc. in a way that there's not really that same kind of like, ooh, what do we do with this communally that you see with Leopold and Loeb.
And do you think the wealth, I don't know how much that was played up, because I would think most American Jews would felt like they're already so different from us, because they seem like they're this sort of, a different socioeconomic level than most Jews at that time.
Yes. I think that's part of what made people feel like, well, it's not like our neighbors, or it's not like our neighborhood or our family. And it doesn't get discussed very explicitly, but you can hear it in things like, oh, the voice on the phone was very cultured, it wasn't gruff. You can see it in things like, taking a car to go places, getting Bobby Franks to join them in a car, which would be not the regular way you'd go a few blocks on the south side of Chicago, right? So it's hard to tell to what extent the economic difference means something, like how are people interpreting it, but you can see it show up at a few moments in the case, right? They're both university students, which is not what everyone in the US did when they turned 18 in 1924.
Great. Well, this has been really, really interesting, and you've provoked a lot of good questions from our audience too. So I really appreciate your being with us this afternoon.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Pleasure. And great to have all you in our audience today. I hope we'll see you at another Jewish Studies talk soon. Have a good afternoon.